Hello, I'm Tony Svejcar with the Agricultural Research Service and the Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center, and I'm here to present an Eastern Oregon Ag Minute. This week I'm going to talk about flood meadows. It's the time of year when water starts to show, and many of us give meadows at least passing thoughts. As I've mentioned previously, many of our flood meadows have experienced large changes in plant species over the last 30 years. These meadows were originally dominated by native sedges, rushes, and grasses. During the 1950s and 60s, there was some excellent research that provided guidelines for managing the meadows. However, sometime in the 70s, we started to see a large increase in meadow foxtail in many but not all of our meadows. Today there are many large fields that are almost completely meadow foxtail, with only a sprinkling of the original meadow species. At some point, that original research may need to be repeated again, since we're now managing a very different kind of meadow. The changes have created both opportunities and problems. As I mentioned yesterday, meadow foxtail now dominates many acres of flood meadow that were previously composed of native sedges, rushes, and grasses. Meadow foxtail is native to temperate Europe and Asia, where it is widely used for hay and pasture. Records indicate it was introduced into western Wyoming in 1888, so it has been in our region for a while. It is often confused with timothy because the seed heads and growth forms are very similar. In forage trials, meadow foxtail ranks high for early growth. Unfortunately, it also ranks high for stem growth and rapid maturity. So this is a great species for early season grazing, but not as great for producing hay in a flood meadow setting. In many years, we cannot get our mowing machines into the meadows at the ideal stage of maturity because the meadows are still too wet. The hay can still be good quality, it's just that we have less control than we would like over when the hay is cut. However, meadow foxtail has better regrowth after grazing than the species it replaced, and this does open up some new opportunities. Yesterday I talked about some of the problems we experience with hay quality and the early maturity of meadow foxtail. Many of the forage yield and quality trials conducted across the U.S. and Canada have evaluated meadow foxtail under sprinkler irrigation, and the growth form of meadow foxtail appears to be affected by type and timing of irrigation. For some reason, the early flooding schedule we use in the Harney Basin seems to hasten maturity of this species. I've toured areas in the southern part of the county where flood water was applied midsummer and then quickly removed. The resulting stand of meadow foxtail is very leafy and of much higher quality than we would expect for many of our Harney Basin flood meadows. Keep in mind that leaf-stem ratio is one of the primary factors affecting forage quality. I've also noticed that meadow foxtail growing around wheel lines and pivots is much leafier than what we typically see in our flood meadows. Unfortunately, there are not many options for controlling irrigation timing for most of our flood meadows. I mentioned earlier this week that the conversion of our flood meadows from the native plants to meadow foxtail has created both problems and opportunities. The fact that this species starts growth early and has high regrowth potential creates some opportunities for grazing. We have traditionally used these flood meadows for hay production, but seldom for grazing, really. Some years ago, grazing trials conducted at the research center resulted in steer gains of almost 3 pounds per day from May to July. This is a tremendous rate of gain. More recently, we tracked weight gains of heifers grazing foxtail meadows. Again, the average daily gain was over 3 pounds per day in May and declined to about 1 pound per day in August. Over the 2-year period, average gain per animal from May to August was 234 pounds. During the second year of the study, the gain per acre was about 200 pounds. These are excellent rates of gain and suggest that foxtail meadows are a valuable grazing resource. Their potential goes well beyond just hay production. Earlier in the week I mentioned that meadow foxtail now dominates many of our flood meadows, and it tends to mature more quickly than the native sedges and rushes it replaced. The problem with the flood meadow is that in most cases we have to wait until at least late June or early July to get hay mowers into the fields. We wondered if we could use early season grazing to delay the development of this species and maybe increase the quality of the hay. Research from Wyoming suggested this might work. We spent 2 years testing the concept. Early season grazing did increase the quality of the hay. Unfortunately, as little as 2 weeks of grazing in early May reduced hay yields by 35 to 40%, which is not what we had expected. In a given year, I would recommend using a meadow foxtail pasture for either hay or grazing, but not for both. If you use such pastures for both haying and grazing, it might make more sense to rotate uses over years. In other words, hay one year, graze the next, or vice versa. I'm Tony Svejcar. Thanks for listening.